what's true is if we don't explore these dances and figure out what they are at a more conscious level, we will continue to do them in the same ways we always have. And what ends up is we end up in places with our conversations or our behaviors of feeling hopeless, right, that nothing will ever change, and it's a very despairing place.
Yeah.
And I think as couples, we all have these. In the beginning, you mentioned that all couples have a dance. I would say all of us have thousands of dances that we have in our lives with everybody, not only our spouses, but our kids, our friends, our colleagues.
Right.
So it becomes a really healthy exploration of each of our lives to figure out how to start talking about what's triggering us in a deeper way.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, and today we'd like to introduce you to a legacy presentation featuring Dr. Mark Laaser and his wife Debbie Laaser. Mark and Debbie will be talking about the relational dances. That's a term that is used here in counseling couples. Mark and Debbie are experts in this field and give great guidance and direction for couples that are on their healing journey together. Here now are Mark and Debbie Laaser in the Faithful and True podcast, Relational Dances.
We have, Randy, a very special guest.
Well, as we prompted our audience with last week, Mark, this is probably the top of our list of favorite in-studio guests.
In-studio guests, that would be the key.
We have Debbie Laaser joining us this morning. Good morning, Debbie.
Good morning. Thanks for having me again.
It's wonderful to have you back. We've been excited to have this show, and today's show is in direct response to one of the emailed questions from one of our listeners. We've been inviting the listeners to submit their comments, to submit their questions, and we are more than happy to have Mark address those issues. The question that was asked of us in a recent email, I'm going to actually just read it to you because the email said, I did want to make a request for a topic for a future Men of Valor podcast. The topic of the dance, as outlined in Debbie's book, Shattered Vows, has been a topic of conversation in our men's group for a while now. It seems to come up more and more as men are struggling with their wives' response to their addiction. The idea of their responses, sometimes unhealthy responses, can create a situation where we are all very vulnerable and are tempted to act out. So it would be great to have a show dedicated to explaining the dynamics of the dance and how that plays out in a realistic way. And we thank our listener for submitting that question, and it's what brings Debbie to our show this morning.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, Randy, ever constantly searching for the correct joke, pun, witty saying, one would be tempted to say this morning, hun, shall we dance?
Oh, I would love to, dear.
See? It's just like being back in the 7th grade.
It really was. You were a little nervous to ask her. You were, and yet she affirmed you with a very positive response.
Yes, right. Well, actually, Deb, why don't we just start by having you kind of talk about where you decided to use this in your book. I know that just about every couple that we work with here at the center that comes to our couples workshop, they have a dance. So we've been working with couples about this for years and years now. So what made you decide to put it in the book the way you did?
Well, I was really interested when I began writing my book to not make it just about a book of pain and reactions to sex addiction. I wanted it to be a book because it was written 20 years into my recovery process to be a book of hope and also why someone would choose to be in a recovery process as a wife. And the reason is, in my opinion, is because there are so many opportunities to grow and change as a person and to make all of your relationships healthier because of what you learn out of the pain of addiction. So explaining the dance was simply, for me, one of the things that I began to learn for myself in terms of how to make my own conversation healthier and my own thoughts and behaviors and choices healthier. And as you were doing that as well, I think what we began to realize is our whole relationship began to change and grow. And so I knew this was a possibility for other wives as well.
Yeah, so one of the key things you said there is that you wrote your book, Shattered Vows, 20 years into our own recovery. I think that's highly significant. I think it would have been a different book if you had written it in year 3 or 4 or maybe even 5.
Well, I think that's very true. And also, I didn't want my book to just to be about my story and what my pain was or what my journey was. And so the significant part of, I think, God waiting for me to write this book at this point was including the hundreds of wives that I then worked with over the years in groups and counseling so that it became a bigger picture story.
Right.
And I think one of the things we learned along the way is recovery is so much more than working on sobriety from an addiction, any addiction for that matter. That if we're really going to grow and thrive and transform our lives, it's about all of these other things that we've learned along the way about how to be a better person, how to relate better to others, how to be safer in our relationships.
Right.
And it's really, I guess, what some back in the 80s, like Ernie Larson, called the second stage, really, of recovery when we're working on bettering ourselves as people. We're not just focusing on addiction.
Yeah, now, I'm just thinking that the average person listening out there, particularly in our field, they may say, what? Because addiction becomes kind of the central focus. It becomes the all-consuming focus. And what you're saying is that there's so much other stuff underneath the addictive behavior that we need to focus on and grow about, that really, in some ways, recovery is therefore an opportunity to work on much deeper issues.
That's exactly right. And, many people write about addiction being an intimacy disorder. And if we're going to kind of explore what that means, I think the dance here is one of the ways that we're trying to clean up how we communicate so as to get closer or to be more intimate with another person.
I think one of the ways to understand the dance is that it's like doing a waltz or a foxtrot, perhaps, or a box step where you can just do the same basic step over and over and over again.
In my eyes, as a innocent observer, this is like the sexual addiction recovery Dancing with the Stars. Debbie has provided a wonderful chart this morning that's called a relational dance. And to make today's program that much more impactful for our listeners, we're going to feature this chart on our show page. When we put the show up on the Faithful and True site today, if you stay on the show page, you'll be able to view this relational dance chart as they listen to you and Deb talk this morning.
Yeah, so we can't assume that all the audience today has the chart in front of them, so we're going to have to be a little bit descriptive. But I think one of the things when we said dance was that it's like going around in circles a little bit, and it's a downward spiraling circle, and it will lead eventually to despair. But why don't you get us started and just talk about how the dance begins?
Well, a dance begins really when one or the other person is what we call triggered, which means basically that something has come along in life and you have an emotional reaction to it. So we know we have an emotional reaction because we're feeling something. We're either feeling really sad or lonely or scared or angry. Some feeling, if we'll allow the feeling to come up, will tell us that something is bothering us, and that would be a trigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the trigger can be so many different stimuli. And so that's the first step of the dance, as one of the partners observes a behavior and has a feeling about it. Would that be true?
That would be true.
All right. Now, part of that first dance step then is that the first partner will somehow cope. Is that part of the dance step? Is that what you're saying?
Well, maybe we should take one of our earlier examples, shall we? from...
If you'd like.
Do you mind? Since I know, many of the folks listening to the show are perhaps in early stages of recovery with one another. One of the things that I know was very triggering to me were many of the sexual acting out experiences that I began to know about your life, so that when new life experiences came along that kind of looked the same, I would be triggered by that. One example that I used in my book was when I had a perception that you were spending too much time or looking at women or something, giving your time, which you would have done in your career as an associate pastor and as a pastoral counselor and working on the school board. You had many opportunities to spend time with women. So the trigger to me would be that I saw that, and then I would feel very sad.
Yeah, and when you were very sad, would you directly let me know that, or would there be other behavioral symptoms of that you were coping?
Well, of course I wouldn't let you know that, and that's how our dance begins, because I hide that part away, and instead of really sharing my sadness with you, I would choose some kind of behavior, or for some, a substance to medicate that or take care of that so I would feel better. For me, typically that would have been getting busy. Because for me, working or getting busy, and of course with 3 young children at the time, there were lots of things to stay busy with. It would help me to block out that sadness. And so getting busy would be my next step in the dance to that trigger.
Yeah, so my first dance step, whatever my behavior actually is, and I mean it's hard to compare back 26 plus years ago. But let's say that I am still in the middle of my addiction. Is that kind of what we're assuming here or not?
No, I think we would assume that you're in recovery at this point and that it's innocent, honorable behavior.
Okay, all right. I'm looking at women or talking to a woman or something like that. Okay, so, my first dance step is because I've observed that you've gotten busy, and my perception of that, of course, would be key, but feelings that would come up for me when you're busy and not being attentive to me, or seem withdrawn, or seem distant somehow, or maybe seem angry but you're not talking about it, would be to go to my own feelings of perhaps anxiety, to go to feelings of sadness. I think one of the things that maybe we need to talk more on this show about is the fact that the average addict like me in recovery is dealing with a certain level of codependency. So, my anxiety about your reactivity, at least in my perception, is going to take me certain places. And then my next step is going to be, any kind of behavior that I would have that's part of my coping. I might ask you lots of questions at that point. I may in my anxiety, want to know what's really going on. I may pursue you around the house. I may want to talk things till all hours of the night, that kind of thing. Is that right?
That could be. So then what I see is your behavior only, and I don't really know about that anxious part because you haven't shared that part of your dance step with me. All I see is what you're doing. So when I see you continuing to pursue and ask lots of questions and try to drag me out of the sad place, then I think my next dance step would be to get angry and frustrated. And so I wouldn't share that part with you, of course.
Yeah.
That would just be my next dance step. And instead, I would choose something else to take care of those emotions. Well, just to finish up what my step would be, if for instance, I got to that place in my dance step, probably I would choose a way to manage that because I wouldn't share with you I'm angry at that point. I would maybe withdraw and stop talking altogether.
Right. So I, of course, in my anxiety, I'm going to notice that withdrawal. Before we move on, though, one of the, I think, great points you made earlier about, the timing of your book was that you've had the opportunity to work with hundreds of wives. Could you speak for a moment to your reaction might be to withdraw, but some of the other wives might have a different reaction?
Well, I was just going to say that that is my typical reaction, and that's one of the things I learned way early in my life was just to be quiet when I was triggered. But certainly, and that's not an unhealthy. That is not a healthy response either, by the way.
Right.
But others may have a reaction to their anger or frustration, which is rage or hitting, physically being responsive in that place, which is also unhealthy. So I think the point is most of our reactions to our triggers are not very healthy unless we're conscious of what we're choosing to do. These dances we get into because we're doing them at an unconscious level. We're reacting to our emotions. We're not taking the time to explore what we're really thinking about, what meanings we're making out of our situations, or consciously choosing healthy reactions.
Yeah, so one of the things you said there also was that, your coping style, which in your case is more about withdrawal, that is much older than our relationship and much older.
I learned to do that as a very little girl.
Yeah, right. So you brought that into our relationship. You certainly wouldn't have even been consciously aware of it then. I wouldn't have been aware of it. In our dating, we were pretty attentive to each other, so I wouldn't have been aware of it until later on. And in the same way with some of the other kinds of coping reactions that some can have, I mean, they may have had those for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. I know in my group last night, one of the women was talking about how she can't control her reaction to her triggers being screaming. Yeah. And she does that not only with her husband, but she does it with her children and in friendships when she gets to this explosive place. It's an autopilot response to a trigger she has. And when she describes her family history, it's all about everybody screaming. That's how they managed their triggers in their family. So she's going to have to work really hard at identifying that, working on changing that reaction, just as I've needed to work very hard on not going to that withdrawal place when I get really hurt or sad or angry.
Right. So the next, dance step for, the husband, in my case, the addict, would be to notice with you the withdrawal. And it could be to notice, some of the other more outwardly violent reaction. By the way, it could be a lot of excessive questions, don't you think? Mm-hmm. I mean, that kind of thing. So if I notice whatever I'm noticing, what anxiety, what sadness, what anger is it now raising in me, and how do I historically cope with that? Well, as a codependent, I may get into one of my super reasonable places and try to talk you out of your reaction. If that's not being successful, then I can revert to some of my individual ways of coping, which would be like you. I think I can get busy at work. My oldest coping, going back to before I was in school, was to watch a lot of TV. Food has always been one of the ways that I cope. So I could still be sober from my sexual addiction, but I could still be coping in some pretty unhealthy ways. And that's my next step in the dance. And of course, then that's what you would observe. Mm-hmm. And then we just keep going.
Right. And if we took this back prior to recovery, I think this is where you might have chosen to act out in some way in response to my coping.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that would have been part of the history there is that because your coping style was to withdraw or get busy, then since I did have exposure to other women and they might be very attentive to me, that became a pretty big vulnerability in my life. Mm-hmm. Now, even if I wasn't a person who crossed the flesh line, I'm just looking at pornography. I'm going to be tempted if my wife is doing something that I perceive as she's withdrawn or she's angry, she doesn't love me, she doesn't want to be with me, then I am going to go on this quest for women who are attentive, kind, wonderful, and all that kind of thing. Now, I want to be clear to say that in recovery, while these vulnerabilities are still going to come up to act out, it's absolutely no excuse to act out. What I think is more important for a lot of the men particularly listening is that while you may stay sober from your sexual addiction, look at some of the other ways that you're coping. And part of the dance, perhaps with your wife, is that she may notice that you're still coping in some of the same ways you used to when you were acting out. And she might even think, well, you're not all that much different, right?
Right. Well, I think we want to give our listeners some hope before we stop the show. So, true is if we don't explore these dances and figure out what they are at a more conscious level, we will continue to do them in the same ways we always have. And what ends up is we end up in places with our conversations or our behaviors of feeling hopeless, that nothing will ever change, and it's a very despairing place.
Yeah.
And I think as couples, we all have these. In the beginning, you mentioned that all couples have a dance. I would say all of us have thousands of dances that we have in our lives with everybody, not only our spouses, but our kids, our friends, our colleagues.
Right.
So it becomes a really healthy exploration of each of our lives to figure out how to start talking about what's triggering us in a deeper way. So what that would mean for me, if I were originally triggered, as I said, I might have been in our example, the hope would be I would start talking about what I was feeling and I would share that with you. That's an intimate, vulnerable thing to do. You know, I'm really sad. I see you spending attention on someone, if that were the case. I would also hopefully share with you what I'm thinking and what's my perception of what I'm seeing, which is not necessarily the truth. It's just my interpretation of what I'm seeing.
Right.
So I might say something like, when I see you giving everyone else attention, I don't feel very important in your life. So by sharing my perception with you, I give you half of a chance to respond to me about what's really going on inside of me. Instead of just looking at my behavior or my dance step, now I've given you a little look about what's inside my soul.
Right. Now, does it help if I respond by trying to talk you out of your perception rationally?
No, it wouldn't. I think what would help is for you to share at that level also.
Yes. So in other words, if I am sharing back what I'm feeling when I see you withdrawing or doing whatever you're doing, and if I share my perception, which strangely enough might be very similar to yours, you know, that you've withdrawn, so my perception is you don't love me, you don't want to be with me, that kind of thing. And sometimes when we get out of these dances, we find out that we have more in common about this than we have that separates us.
So you're telling me that honest, open communication is a good thing?
Well, yeah, not just any, we can honestly and openly communicate about facts. I think one of the things we're trying to communicate to the listeners is don't try to solve these dances by solving the behavioral problem, whether you are looking at women or not. You know, talk about the feelings, the perceptions. Would you also say that in a situation like that, you at a deeper level, you have needs and desires?
Exactly, and that could be another thing I share. Instead of just taking my dance step, is I could share with you something I might need, which is, you know, I'm missing you. I would like to spend more time together. And I know you have a lot of work to do out and about, and, you know, my need might be to find more time together. Right. So by sharing those things, and as soon as we can share some of those things in our dances, what we find is we stop the old dance and we begin to communicate at a more intimate level. And that's really what growing as a couple is about. And I know this is difficult, and I surely want, you know, our listeners to understand that we don't expect people to be able to, like, just do this on their own. I think the truth is, if we were capable of doing this on our own, we would have done that way long ago in our relationship. And we needed help. We needed fair witnesses. We needed counselors to help us figure out how to do this in a safe way, because triggers are just that. They're triggering. And when we're triggered, we tend to just take care of ourselves, and that's that. So it's a difficult thing to build into a healthy relationship, and such a worthwhile one, which is, again, why we promote getting help, getting in safe communities to practice how to do some of this.
Would it be true, and this is something that you and I were working on early on in our recovery, is that they're, you know, just as an addict at some point recognizes that they're powerless over their addiction, a couple, I think, also recognizes at some point with, you know, because of dances like this, that we're powerless over our relationship. Would that be true?
I find that to be very true. And the truth is, we're all at some level powerless over how we cope with triggers in our life. We as wives are too. Our coping is different. It's not maybe sex addiction, but it's other things that can be just as hurtful to creating a safe and intimate relationship with someone. So if we desire to have that, when we're going to need to work at understanding what that is for ourselves.
One of the things I'm liking about what you say, I know we're running out of time, but maybe we need to have this guest back.
She has more than proven her value to the show today, and it just reminds us both that she is a powerful and valuable valuable guest to the Men of Valor program.
That is true, and I think we're also learning that a whole lot of wives are listening out there as well. But what let's give the listeners some encouragement here. One of the things you're saying is that we may need other people to be around us to help us practice getting out of these dance steps. And one of the things that I so appreciated about Debbie early on was that she was willing to look at herself, look at her own triggers, look at her own coping. I think you heard that today. Even though, the first 3 years were not all that, smooth, Debbie jumped in real early, and, that was one of my blessings. So partly what we're saying is that getting out of this dance will involve both the husband and wife working equally hard on their own stuff. What would you like to leave particularly the wives with today?
Well, I would like them to know, especially if they're listening to this program, that I don't want to be minimizing the pain and the struggle of your spouses working on a good recovery program for sex addiction, because that is definitely an important problem to overcome. And just working on dances is not a piece that will solve that problem. So that foremost is foundational to couples growing. However, what I would like wives to know is if you have a desire for your relationship to be transformed and to be something better than hopefully it has ever really been in your life, it will take both of you working at relational issues and looking at yourselves to also know how you can become a healthier, safer person to be with. And I think that's the challenge all of us face, and that God is calling all of us to become the people He wants us to be, which would be to be safe and nurturing and non-judgmental and present in our relationships. And that takes a lot of work.
Yeah, well, thanks, hon, for being here, and it's always fun for me. And for me, last word, men, stay sober. There's no chance of getting out of this dance if you're acting out. So get your act together. Be a man of valor. Get sober. Do what you need to do. Okay. How's that?
Well, the two of you have been on a roll today, and the wisdom that has been flowing from you both has been inspirational today. I want to remind everybody, because we really don't self-promote over the top. Debbie's book, Shattered Vows, is such a powerful resource for any of the wives out there. It's available on at faithfulandtrue.com in our bookstore, along with their book, 7 Desires, The 7 Desires of Every Heart, all of Mark's books. And we do encourage you to visit the bookstore and check out these resources. They're very powerful.
Thank you for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that today's podcast has been a beneficial one for you, that you've been able to benefit from the words and experience of Mark and Debbie Laaser. We hope that you'll visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many additional resources, including over 550 podcasts such as this one. We also hope that you'll find the information that we provide on the website about our 3-day intensives. We host the Men's Journey Workshop every month and have that available for men who are struggling with sexual addiction or pornography addiction. And then 3 times a year, we host the Women's Journey Workshop for their spouses and the 2 different versions of our Couples Journey Workshops. Please check us out at faithfulandtrue.com. In the meantime, we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.